The morning the Duke of Ashworth arrived at Pemberton Manor to choose a bride, there were 6 daughters waiting in the drawing room. They had been arranged by their mother with the precision of a military deployment. Charlotte, the eldest, stood nearest the window where the light was most flattering, wearing a gown of pale rose silk that had been purchased specifically for this occasion and altered twice. Behind her, Harriet and Louisa occupied the settee in matching blue muslin, positioned to suggest elegance without appearing to compete with their elder sister. Victoria stood by the pianoforte, ready to play if asked, her fingers already resting on the lid. Jane, the youngest at 16, sat on a footstool near the fire, present but not prominent, because their mother believed in displaying the full range of her accomplishments even when the youngest was not yet out. And then there was Margaret. Margaret was 24. She was the 4th daughter, which meant she had spent her entire life positioned between Victoria's musical talent and Jane's youthful prettiness without possessing either quality in sufficient measure to distinguish herself. She was not plain. Her features were regular, her eyes were dark and steady, her hair was the kind of brown that people described as sensible rather than striking. She played the pianoforte adequately. She danced competently. She made conversation that was intelligent without being memorable, and she moved through rooms with a composure that people interpreted as shyness or dullness or both, depending on how generous they were feeling. She had been placed by the bookcase at the far end of the drawing room in a dress of dove gray that her mother had not purchased for the occasion because her mother had not considered her a serious contender. The dress was 2 seasons old. It fitted well because Margaret was the kind of woman whose body did not change from year to year, which her mother considered a disadvantage and Margaret considered a convenience. She had been told to be present, to be pleasant, and to not draw attention from Charlotte, which was a set of instructions Margaret could have followed in her sleep. She was reading when the Duke arrived, not pretending to read, actually reading a volume of Gibbon that she had taken from her father's library, and that she was holding at an angle that allowed her to see the page without appearing to ignore the room. She had mastered this particular posture years ago. It was the posture of a woman who had learned that she would not be noticed and had decided to use the invisibility productively. The Duke of Ashworth was not what any of them had expected. He was 31, tall, with dark hair cut shorter than fashion dictated, and a face that was handsome in the way that competent faces are handsome. Not beautiful, not romantic, but structured and clear and difficult to dismiss. He walked into the drawing room with the contained energy of a man who did not enjoy social occasions, but understood them as a necessary function of his position, and he was accompanied by his mother, the Dowager Duchess, who was 63 and had a reputation for speaking her mind with a directness that most people found either refreshing or terrifying, depending on whether they were the subject of it. Mrs. Pemberton greeted them. Charlotte was presented first. She curtsied beautifully, smiled beautifully, said something about the weather that was perfectly calibrated to be charming without being forward. Harriet and Louisa were presented together and performed their respective curtsies with the synchronized grace of 2 women who had been practicing. Victoria played a brief piece on the pianoforte that was technically flawless and emotionally precise. Jane curtsied with the wide-eyed sweetness of a girl who knows she is too young to be chosen, but enjoys being looked at nonetheless. The Duke observed all of this with an expression that was polite and attentive, and revealed nothing whatsoever about what he was thinking. Then his gaze moved to the far end of the room. Margaret did not see him looking at her, because she was looking at Gibbon. She was reading about the decline of Roman provincial governance, and she had reached a passage that interested her, and she had briefly forgotten, as she sometimes did when she was reading, that she was in a room full of people who were performing for an audience. "And who is this?" the Duke said. Mrs. Pemberton's smile tightened by approximately 1 degree. "That is Margaret," she said, "my 4th. Margaret, put the book down." Margaret looked up. She closed the book, keeping her finger in the page, which she did not notice, but the Duke did, and stood. She curtsied. It was a competent curtsy, neither beautiful nor clumsy, the curtsy of a woman who had been curtsying at gatherings for 7 seasons without once being the reason someone attended one. "What are you reading?" the Duke asked. "Gibbon," Margaret said, "the 3rd volume." "Which part?" "The provincial administration under Diocletian, though I think Gibbon is too generous to the reforms. The tax restructuring was efficient, but it impoverished the provincial towns, and he glosses over that rather conveniently." The room was very quiet. Charlotte's smile had become fixed. Mrs. Pemberton's fingers had tightened on the arm of her chair. The Dowager Duchess, standing behind her son, had tilted her head very slightly to one side, the way a bird tilts its head when it has spotted something interesting. "I think you are right," the Duke said. "He does gloss over it. Though, in fairness, the sources for provincial taxation in that period are limited." "They are," Margaret said, "but that is a reason for caution, not a reason for optimism. He chose to interpret the gap in the evidence as confirmation of success, which is a habit of his." The Duke looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Would you walk with me in the garden, Miss Pemberton?" Mrs. Pemberton opened her mouth to suggest Charlotte, to redirect, to do the thing that mothers of 6 daughters do when the wrong daughter is being asked to walk in the garden. But the Dowager Duchess placed her hand on Mrs. Pemberton's arm and said very quietly, "Let them go." They walked in the garden for 45 minutes. The first 10 were spent on Gibbon, because the Duke had questions about her argument and Margaret had answers, and neither of them noticed that they had walked past the rose garden and the ornamental fountain and were heading toward the kitchen garden, which was not the part of the grounds that Mrs. Pemberton had intended for ducal viewing. The next 10 were spent on the Ashworth estate, because the Duke mentioned the orchard and Margaret mentioned the grafting pamphlet, and he stopped walking and turned to face her and said, "You have read agricultural pamphlets?" And she said, "I have read most things. There is very little else to do in this house when one is the 4th daughter and nobody is watching." He looked at her when she said this, not with pity, not with amusement, but with recognition, the specific recognition of a man who understands what it is to be in a room without being seen. The remaining 25 minutes were spent on subjects that had nothing to do with Rome or orchards, on the sound the river made in winter when it ran high enough to reach the willow roots, on the particular blue of the sky over Derbyshire in October, on whether it was possible to read too much, which Margaret said it was not, and the Duke said it was. And this was their first disagreement, and Margaret found that disagreeing with the Duke of Ashworth was one of the most enjoyable experiences of her life, because he disagreed back with evidence rather than authority, which was something she had never encountered from a man of his rank. When they returned, the Duke thanked Mrs. Pemberton for her hospitality, said goodbye to all 6 daughters, and left with his mother in his carriage. The carriage had not reached the end of the drive before Charlotte began to cry, and Mrs. Pemberton told Margaret that she had embarrassed the family by talking about Roman tax policy in front of a duke, and Margaret went to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and opened Gibbon to the page she had been reading and did not think about the Duke of Ashworth at all for approximately 15 minutes, which was longer than she expected to last and shorter than she wanted. The proposal arrived 3 days later. It was addressed to Mr. Pemberton, and it was brief and formal, and it asked for Margaret. The house went silent in the way that houses go silent when something has happened that nobody anticipated, and everybody is recalculating. Charlotte did not speak for 2 days. Harriet and Louisa exchanged looks that communicated an entire conversation without words. Victoria played the pianoforte with a ferocity that suggested she was working through feelings she could not name. Jane, who was 16, and therefore honest in ways that older sisters had learned not to be, said, "I think it is wonderful. Margaret deserves something wonderful." Mrs. Pemberton sat with Margaret in the morning room and said, with the careful bewilderment of a mother who loves all her children but has clear ideas about their respective futures, "I do not understand it." "I know," Margaret said. "Charlotte is more beautiful. Victoria is more accomplished. Even Harriet has better conversation." "I know, Mama. What did you talk about in the garden?" "Gibbon, and the drainage of the Ashworth estate, and whether Plutarch is more reliable than Livy, and the best method for grafting apple trees." Mrs. Pemberton stared at her. "Apple trees. He has an orchard at Ashworth that is not producing. I suggested a grafting technique I read about in a pamphlet from the Royal Horticultural Society." "Margaret, he is a duke." "I am aware that he is a duke, Mama. He is also a man with a failing orchard, and I happen to know something useful about it." Margaret accepted the proposal. Not because she was in love. She was not a woman who dealt in feelings she had not examined, and she had not yet had time to examine this one. She accepted because the Duke of Ashworth had asked her a question about what she was reading and had listened to her answer, and had not flinched or redirected or looked over her shoulder at her more decorative sisters. He had listened. And in 24 years of drawing rooms and dinner tables and assemblies and balls, No one had ever listened to Margaret Pemberton with that degree of attention. They were married in September, at the chapel on the Ashworth estate. The wedding was larger than Margaret would have preferred, 80 guests, because a duke's wedding carries social obligations that cannot be avoided. But the Duke had consulted her on every detail, which Charlotte would not learn about until later, and which, when she did learn about it, caused her to go quiet in a different way than before. Margaret wore ivory silk with a high waist and long sleeves, and her mother's pearl earrings, and her hair pinned in the simple style she had always worn, because elaborate styles required a willingness to sit still for an hour while someone fussed with pins, and Margaret had never considered that a reasonable use of an hour. She walked down the aisle with her father, who held her arm tightly enough that she could feel his hand trembling, and who whispered, just before they reached the altar, "He is a lucky man, and I intend to tell him so at every opportunity." The Duke stood at the altar and watched her walk toward him, and his face was composed in the way that his face was always composed, careful, contained, revealing nothing. But his hands, clasped behind his back, were not still. They were moving, thumb pressing against forefinger, the small, unconscious gesture of a man who is feeling something too large for his expression to accommodate. They arrived at Ashworth that evening, and the house was lit with candles in every window, because Mrs. Harding, the housekeeper, had decided without consulting anyone that the new Duchess should see the house at its best. Margaret stood in the entrance hall and looked up at the stone walls and the portraits and the grand staircase and the candlelight reflected in the polished floor. And she said, "It is very large." And the Duke said, "It is." And Margaret said, "I shall need a map." And the Duke almost smiled, and Mrs. Harding, standing 3 steps behind them, saw it. The first weeks at Ashworth were spent learning the house and the grounds and the particular rhythms of a property that had been managed competently but without imagination for longer than anyone cared to admit. Margaret walked every corridor, visited every room, spoke to every member of staff. She learned that the second footman's mother was ill in Cheshire, and that the kitchen maid was saving for passage to visit a sister in Dublin, and that Mrs. Harding had been running the house for 16 years and had not taken a day's rest in 4. She learned these things because she asked, and she asked because she was interested. And she was interested because people had always interested her more than they realized, and more than she let on. London was where the trouble began. The Duke sat in the House of Lords during the autumn session, which meant they took a house in Mayfair for October and November, and Margaret entered London society not as a debutante, but as a duchess, which was simultaneously easier and harder than either. Easier because no one could refuse to receive her. Harder because everyone who received her had already decided who she was. The whispers started within a week. She heard them the way one hears rain on a window, not every drop, but enough to know it was raining. She is the plain one. There were 5 others, and he chose the plain one. Mrs. Pemberton must be beside herself. Charlotte was right there. I heard she was reading a book when he arrived. A book. In the drawing room, while her sisters were being presented. The Arrogance. She is perfectly pleasant, I suppose, in a quiet sort of way. Margaret heard these things and did not react to them. Not because she did not feel them. She felt them the way she felt cold air or a stone in her shoe, as a discomfort that was real, but that she refused to allow to govern her movement. She had spent 24 years being overlooked. Being talked about was, in its own way, a form of visibility she had not sought and did not welcome, but she understood that it was the price of the position she now occupied, and she would pay it without complaint. She attended a tea given by Lady Forsyth in the first week of November, and sat for 90 minutes in a drawing room where 3 women discussed the Duke's choice as though she were not present. They spoke in the third person, the Duchess this, the Duchess that, while Margaret sat 4 feet away with a cup of tea she had not been offered but had poured for herself, because no one had thought to offer. She drank the tea. She contributed, when addressed directly, observations that were brief and intelligent, and entirely wasted on an audience that was not listening for intelligence. She left at precisely the appropriate time, thanked Lady Forsyth at the door, and walked to the carriage with the same straight-backed composure she had maintained for the entire visit. In the carriage, alone, she closed her eyes for approximately 30 seconds, and when she opened them, the moment had passed and she was herself again. The Duke heard them too. He heard them at his club, where a man he had known at Cambridge made a joke about bookish brides that 3 other men laughed at. He heard them at a dinner hosted by the Countess of Maresfield, where a woman seated across from him told another woman, not quite quietly enough, that the Duchess of Ashworth was proof that persistence outlasts beauty. He heard them from his own cousin, Lord Hadley, who said at a family luncheon, "You must tell us, Ashworth, what on earth she said about Gibbon that was more compelling than Charlotte Pemberton's face." The Duke set down his fork. He looked at his cousin, and he said, in the voice he used in the House of Lords when he wished to be heard clearly and remembered precisely, "She said that Gibbon was too generous to the reforms of Diocletian, and she was correct. And I have spent every day since that conversation grateful that I was not fool enough to choose a wife based on whether she would look well next to me at dinner rather than whether she could hold her own across the table." Lord Hadley did not raise the subject again, but it was not enough. The whispers did not stop, because a duke defended his wife at a family luncheon. They stopped, eventually, because of what happened at the Whitmore Ball. The Whitmore Ball was the last significant event of the autumn season, held at Lord Whitmore's house on Park Lane, attended by 200 people, and treated by society as a final opportunity to assess, rank, and gossip about everyone of consequence before the families dispersed to their estates for Christmas. Margaret wore a gown of deep emerald silk, not dove gray, not the muted colors of a woman trying to disappear, but emerald, chosen by the Duke, who had said without elaboration, "I would like people to see you." Margaret had looked at the dress and then at him and said, "They will see the dress," and he had said, "They will see the woman in it, which is the point." They arrived together. They were announced together. 200 faces turned toward the doors, and Margaret felt the weight of 200 assessments landing on her simultaneously. Her face, her figure, her dress, her hair, her posture, the way she held the Duke's arm, the way she carried herself into a room full of people who had already decided she did not belong. She carried herself the way she carried herself everywhere, straight-backed, steady-eyed, composed, not performing confidence, being composed, which was different, and which the people watching could feel even if they could not articulate it. There was something in the way Margaret Pemberton moved through a room that made people reconsider their assumptions without knowing why. She was not beautiful. She was not striking. She was present, fully, unapologetically, irreducibly present, in a way that beauty sometimes obscures and plainness sometimes permits. The Duke danced the first dance with her. This was expected. It would have been noted if he had not. But then he danced the second dance with her, which was unusual, and the third, which was pointed. By the fourth dance, the room had begun to understand that the Duke of Ashworth was not performing a social obligation. He was making a statement. Between dances, he introduced her. Not in the way that a husband introduces a wife at a ball, a name, a title, a nod, a move along. He introduced her with context. To the Lord Chancellor, he said, "My wife has a perspective on provincial taxation under Diocletian that I think would interest you. She argues that Gibbon's interpretation of the reforms is overly generous, and I believe she is right." To the Countess of Lyndhurst, he said, "Margaret has been corresponding with the Royal Horticultural Society about apple grafting. She has a method that I have implemented at Ashworth, and the results this autumn were extraordinary." To a group of 3 MPs standing by the refreshment table, he said, "If you are serious about the school reform bill, you should speak to the Duchess. She has read the proposed legislation more carefully than anyone I know, including its authors." Margaret stood beside him while he did this. She did not blush or stammer or deflect with the practiced modesty that society expected from women who were being praised. She engaged. When the Lord Chancellor asked about Diocletian, she answered with the same quiet precision she had shown in her father's drawing room, and the Lord Chancellor listened with the expression of a man who is reassessing something he thought he already understood. When the MPs asked about the school reform bill, she outlined 3 specific weaknesses in the proposed funding mechanism, and one of the MPs took a notebook from his coat pocket and wrote something down, which Margaret noticed, and the Duke noticed, and which neither of them mentioned afterward, but both of them remembered. By the end of the evening, something had shifted. Not dramatically. Society does not reverse its judgments in a single night. But the whispers changed. They did not stop, but they changed texture, the way a conversation changes when new information arrives that cannot be dismissed. She is not what I expected. She knew more about the bill than Hadley did, and Hadley sits on the committee. He looks at her differently than other men look at their wives. He looks at her as though he is watching her win something that the rest of us have not yet realized is a competition. The Dowager Duchess, who had attended the ball and had watched the entire evening from a chair near the wall with the calm satisfaction of a woman who had known something before everyone else, said to Margaret in the carriage home, "They will talk about tonight for the rest of the season." "They will talk about the dress," Margaret said. "No," the Dowager said. "They will talk about the woman in it, just as my son intended." The months that followed confirmed what the Whitmore ball had begun. Margaret did not become London's most celebrated duchess. She did not conquer society or win over every drawing room or silence every whisper. She did something quieter and more lasting. She became someone who could not be ignored. At Ashworth, she oversaw the estate through the steward, a man named Harding, with the same analytical precision she brought to Gibbon and the school reform bill. The orchard produced its best yield in 11 years after the grafting. The tenant school she proposed, modeled on a pamphlet she had read about parish education in Germany, opened in March and enrolled 23 children within the first month. The drainage on the northern fields was resolved using a method she had found in an agricultural journal, which Harding implemented with the slightly stunned efficiency of a man who has been presented with a better idea than his own and is honest enough to admit it. She read voraciously and without apology. The library at Ashworth, which had been decorative under the previous Duke, became functional, reorganized, recatalogued, and expanded by 200 volumes within the first year, including a complete set of agricultural reports from the Royal Society that Margaret had written to request personally. The Duke found her there most evenings in the chair by the east window, with a book in her lap and a pencil in her hand, and the particular expression she wore when she was thinking, focused, still, alive with the private intensity of a mind that had spent 24 years running at full capacity with no one to run alongside. He ran alongside her now. Not ahead of her, not behind her, but beside her, which was the thing that Margaret had not known she wanted until she had it. He brought her problems from the House of Lords, legislation he was uncertain about, speeches he was drafting, questions of policy that he could not resolve alone, and she read them and annotated them and returned them with observations that were so precise and so useful that he once told Harding, in a moment of unguarded honesty, that his wife was the best political mind he had ever encountered, and Harding, who had been at Ashworth for 20 years and had served 2 dukes, said, "I believe you are correct, Your Grace." There was an evening in February, a cold night, the kind where the windows rattle and the fire cannot keep pace with the draught, when the Duke came into the library and found Margaret asleep in the chair by the east window. The book had slipped from her lap. The pencil was still in her hand, which had fallen against the arm of the chair, and her head had tilted to one side, and her face in sleep was different from her face in waking, softer, unguarded, without the careful composure she wore like a second skin in every room she entered. He stood in the doorway and looked at her and understood something he had been circling for months without landing on. He was not merely grateful for her. He was not merely impressed by her. He loved her, not for what she could do, for the estate, for the legislation, for the library, for who she was when no one was looking, for the woman asleep in a cold room with a pencil in her hand and a book on the floor, and no idea that she was being watched by a man who had never expected to feel this way about anyone, least of all the quiet daughter by the bookcase whom the world had told him to overlook. He picked up the book. He covered her with a blanket from the back of the settee. He put another log on the fire. And he left without waking her, because some things do not need to be said to be real, and the saying of them at the wrong moment can make them smaller than they are. Their first child was born the following autumn, a boy named Edward, after the Duke's father. He had Margaret's dark, steady eyes and the Duke's jaw, and a temperament that suggested he would, in time, have opinions about things and the patience to support them with evidence. Their daughter arrived 2 years later, Alice, named for the Dowager, who received this honor with the composed delight of a woman who expected no less and was gratified to be proven right. Alice had her father's energy and her mother's composure and an early interest in the library that pleased both of her parents. Charlotte married the following year, a viscount of moderate means and considerable charm, who made her laugh and admired her beauty with the uncomplicated devotion of a man who knew exactly what he valued and was content with it. Charlotte and Margaret, who had never been close in the way that sisters who are competing for the same resources cannot be close, became friends in the way that sisters who are no longer competing can. Charlotte visited Ashworth with her husband every Christmas, and she and Margaret walked the grounds together in the cold and talked about their children and their marriages, and once about the morning the Duke arrived at Pemberton Manor and chose the daughter no one expected. I was furious, Charlotte said. For months I could not understand it. I know, Margaret said. Do you understand it now? Margaret thought about this. I think he saw someone who was not trying to be seen, she said, and he recognized that, because he is not someone who tries to be seen either. We were two people at the edges of the room, and we found each other there. That is very romantic, Charlotte said, for a woman who once described her engagement as a satisfactory outcome of a conversation about Roman tax policy. Margaret smiled. It was a very good conversation. Years later, when Edward was 8 and Alice was 6, and the library had expanded by another 300 volumes, and the tenant school had grown to 41 children, and the orchard was producing so abundantly that Harding had begun selling the surplus at market, the Duke was invited to speak at a dinner hosted by the Lord Chancellor in honor of the year's legislative achievements. He was expected to speak about the Education Reform Bill, which had passed with his support and which contained, in its final form, 2 of the 3 amendments Margaret had suggested in the margin of the draft he had brought home 18 months earlier. He stood at the head of the table, in a room full of lords and MPs and their wives, and he began by speaking about the bill, and then he stopped speaking about the bill and said something else. I was asked once, he said, what it was about my wife that compelled me to choose her. The question was not asked kindly. It was asked by people who believed they already knew the answer, which was that I had made a mistake, that I had overlooked obvious superiority in favor of something less visible and therefore less valuable. I would like to say that I responded with patience and grace, but in truth I responded with irritation, because the question revealed more about the people asking it than it did about the woman they were asking about. The room was very still. My wife was reading Gibbon when I met her, he said. She was sitting by a bookcase in her father's drawing room, in a dress that was 2 seasons old, and she was reading about Roman provincial governance, and when I asked her opinion she gave it, clearly, precisely, without the slightest interest in whether it was the opinion I wanted to hear. I had spent the previous 3 years being told by every drawing room in England what I wanted. She was the first person who told me what she thought, and I understood in that moment that I did not want a woman who would ornament my life. I wanted a woman who would challenge it. He paused. She has challenged it every day since. She has made this estate more productive, this household more efficient, and this man, considerably, embarrassingly, irreversibly, better than he was before she arrived. Every room she has entered has been improved by her presence, and I will spend the rest of my life making certain that every room knows it. Margaret was sitting 6 chairs away. She was wearing emerald silk, the same color as the Whitmore ball, because some things become tradition not through intention, but through meaning. Her expression was the same expression she had worn in her father's drawing room when she looked up from Gibbon and saw a man she did not yet know looking at her as though he had found something he had not been expecting to find. Steady, clear, unperforming, alive. The room applauded. Margaret did not applaud. She looked at her husband across the length of the table, and he looked at her. And between them was the particular silence of 2 people who do not need an audience to know what they are to each other, but who do not mind, when the occasion calls for it, letting the audience see. Later in the carriage she said, "You did not need to do that." "I know," he said. "The bill was the subject, not me. The bill exists because of you. The amendments were yours. The research was yours. You sat at the desk in the library for 3 weeks and read every piece of evidence the committee had considered and found the gaps they had missed, and you did it because you believed the bill mattered, not because you wanted credit. So I gave you the credit because someone should, and because I am tired of rooms full of people who do not know what I know." "And what do you know?" He took her hand. "That I walked into a drawing room looking for a wife and found the finest mind in England sitting by the bookcase in a gray dress reading Gibbon, and that every day since then has been the most fortunate accident of my life." Margaret held his hand. The carriage moved through the London streets. The gas lamps cast moving light across the windows, and outside the city went about its business, indifferent to the 2 people inside the carriage and the distance they had traveled, from a drawing room where no one expected her to be noticed, to a table where everyone watched her husband stand and tell a room full of the most powerful men in England that the best thing he had ever done was choose the girl no one else wanted. If this found you tonight, the next one will find you too. They arrive here like a woman at the edge of a room whenever you look closely enough to notice.